Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Christina Byrne, and I'm the OCTA Public Outreach Department Manager. We will be beginning shortly. This meeting is being recorded for your information, and I will also be mentioning a few housekeeping items before we get started. Again, we're going to go ahead and get started in just one moment. We're just waiting for people to log on. And this session is being recorded this evening for your information. Again, my name is Christina Byrne, and I'm the Department Manager for Public Outreach at OCTA. I wanted to mention a few housekeeping items before we get started. Our meeting this evening, again, is recorded and will be posted on the Coastal Rail Resiliency Study website. I encourage all participants this evening to go to that website frequently. On the website, we not only will have the recording of this presentation and the PowerPoint presentation, but we also have our fact sheet for the Coastal Rail Resiliency Study, our frequently asked questions, initial assessment, and other materials. Tonight includes a brief presentation on the study conducted by Dan Fu, the project manager, and myself. Followed by the presentation, I will facilitate the listening session portion of this evening. We have quite a few attendees, and in order to hear from as many participants as possible, I respectfully request that you keep your remarks to approximately 2 minutes if possible, or less per person. Please note also if other folks have brought up something similar, made up similar points in the discussion. We're here to listen, and the listening sessions we have held since February have been very helpful for us working on this study. Please keep in mind that we may not have all the answers this evening, but we will do our best to answer questions to the extent possible. And again, I encourage you to frequently go to our website for the latest and greatest on the study as we move forward. Next slide, please.
This meeting is going to be recorded, as Christina mentioned, to capture your input accurately. We welcome comments, and please note that they will be addressed after the presentation during the listening session. However, we do encourage you to use the Q&A button to submit comments throughout the presentation. Both written and verbal comments are equally considered by the team, so please feel free to utilize both methods. And our team will be utilizing the chat function to share out information to all of the participants, which includes links to resources. If you wish to listen to this meeting, if you wish to set up the closed captioning, please select the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And as you noted, this meeting is a Zoom webinar, and it's intended to do it. It's done purposely to ensure a positive experience for all participants. Next slide. Your participation is extremely important to us, and this is how you can participate. If you are joining us via web, please submit your verbal comments or questions. Please raise your hand, and you can see the function there if you would like to make a verbal comment or ask a question. If you have a written comment, please select the Q&A function and submit your comment and question in that form. We welcome you to include your name and your organization if you are representing any. And when we announce your name, please unmute your audio, and then you will be able to ask your question. After you submit your question, you will be remuted. We notice that some of you are calling via phone. To participate via phone, please press *9 on your keypad to raise your hand, and our team will announce you by the last 4 digits of your phone number. Press *6 to unmute your audio, and after you provide your comment, you will be remuted. Again, both verbal and written comments are considered equally. I'm going to hand it over to Dan to review the agenda for tonight.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Christina. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Dan Fu. I'm with the Planning Division. So tonight, I'm going to provide some background and history on the challenges we've been facing with respect to the coastal rail. And then I'm going to get into a little more details on the potential reinforcement area, which are the immediate kind of needs to address some of the ongoing challenges. And then Christina is going to round it out in terms of providing you with the feedback that we've received thus far, as well as the listening sessions and the next steps. So next slide, please. So just to quickly put kind of the context of OCTA's role with respect to the railroad in Orange County, OCTA owns approximately 40 miles of the rail corridor in Orange County. It is part of the Losan corridor, otherwise known as the Los Angeles, San Diego, San Luis Obispo rail corridor. We also serve as the managing agency for the Losan rail corridor, and OCTA is also a member of the Metrolink, or the Southern California Regional Rail Authority. I think what is really key and important with respect to the southern part of the 40-mile stretch of the rail corridor is that 7 miles of the 40 miles are located along the coast in southern Orange County, between the San Diego Orange County line all the way up to approximately the city of Dana Point. And much of that stretch is actually very close to the coastline, as you can see in the slide there, 200 feet or less away from the coastline. Next slide. So in terms of just kind of looking back on the history of the railroad, it's been in operation since the late 1800s. And in looking at challenges and so forth over the last 130 plus years, we have experienced a total of a handful of closures. So you can see in the late 1930s, as well as the early 1990s, there have been closures. But when you kind of leap forward into the fall of 2021, we've had 5 closures. So that leads us to basically address something that is an ongoing challenge that has become much more frequent in recent years. And I think that is something that I'll talk more about later in terms of how we look at the phases of this study. Next slide. So in terms of the changing conditions, in looking back approximately 50 years ago, even with the land use in this particular part of San Clemente, milepost 206.8 is actually near the Cypress Shore community, and it is the southern part of the city of San Clemente. And if you look at 50 years ago, the land use pattern and so forth was very different than when you leap forward into the 2010s. And in looking at the picture on the right, upper right corner, it shows the beach being pretty wide. And then something happened along the way in 2017 where the beach never really came back. And that seemed to have worsened over the years. Next slide. So this particular list is just really a listing of 4 projects that OCTA has undertaken over the last 3 years, all within the city of San Clemente over a 4-mile stretch of the railroad within the city of San Clemente. And I think the total is roughly about $38 million that OCTA has invested to protect the rail line due to a number of emergencies that we have experienced over the years. And then the last 2 projects are projects that the city of San Clemente is partnering, whether it's with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers on the sand replenishment or the Coastal Commission on a nature-based feasibility study. We've been monitoring those efforts, and the idea is to integrate, to the extent feasible, some of what others have been working on. That's not just the city of San Clemente, it also includes the County of Orange and others into our larger effort. Next slide. So this is what I was alluding to earlier, understanding there's been a lot of challenges over the last handful of years to the tune of 5 closures within a 3-year period. We need to really look at the railroad in terms of the ultimate disposition. And that's really what you see on the right-hand side with the long-term solutions. That is really a phase 2 study. We parse this into, in a way, kind of a 2-phase study. Phase 1 is looking at protecting the railroad in place for the next foreseeable future, which we estimate will be up to the 30-year period. And then beyond that, there would need to be some study, and that's not to suggest we're going to undertake that study 30 years from now, but concurrently, there will be a study to look at the long-term disposition of the railroad to see where it would make sense to potentially relocate it. And for those of you who are familiar with what's happening in San Diego, there's something similar happening down with respect to our partner agency down in Sandag, looking at realignment of approximately 1.7 mile stretch of the railroad within the Del Mar area. So in terms of the short and midterm study, which is the subject of today's discussion, we're looking at solutions that would basically last us upwards of a decade, and then also midterm solutions that would last perhaps several decades in the meantime while we're looking at longer term solutions. And I think what we also did was an added piece, which was to include the immediate term, meaning with respect to the emergencies and being reactive over the last handful of years, over a number of emergencies that we have faced, we had our consultant team looked at what are the immediate needs out there, and I'll get into more of those immediate needs. Next slide, please. So in terms of the study schedule, what I alluded to in terms of parsing it out, even within this phase 1 into 3 pieces, the first piece would be looking at addressing the immediate needs that are out there so we can get ahead of the next storm season and not have to react to additional emergencies. That's really our plan. And then for the short and midterm, that's on the bottom part of this graphic, which shows that we're basically concluding the listening sessions for the basically at the startup of this study. And then the idea is to basically have the consultant team go to the drawing board with the feedback that we've received today, and then come back in the fall with draft concepts, and then we'll have another round of public input that you can see on the graphic there. And then this will be repeated as we have major milestones that we're going to be rolling out information to share with the public and also soliciting feedback. And then we're going to look to round the study out by the fall of 2025. Next slide. So with respect to the areas that I had alluded to earlier, there are 4 areas that the team had looked at and determined that there are immediate needs in those areas in terms of addressing whether it's a lack of beach on the coastal side or potential landslides on the inland side. There are 4 different areas. Again, they're all located within the city of San Clemente. In fact, some of them are overlapping with previous emergencies that we've seen, one in particular. So just kind of looking at the 3 areas from the north to the south, 3 of those areas are located to the north of the San Clemente Pier. That's kind of to get the everyone's bearing. And then 3 of those 4 areas are located on the seaward side where we have identified challenges. And then 1 particular area is located on the inland side. And then you can also see we call this updated potential solutions primarily because when we rolled this out in March, it was the same 4 areas, but we had not included sand as part of the immediate solutions. It was contemplated to be a subsequent phase in terms of including the sand, primarily due to its complexity with the permitting processes. So due to the public feedback, we have included sand as a project feature. And really the idea is to offset any potential environmental impacts of the engineering solutions. So next slide, please. So for the next several slides, I'm just going to go over some of the concepts. I want to emphasize these are very much planning level concepts. They're not engineering concepts. We don't have survey information in here. We don't have detailed design information in here. This is really very much at I would say, a 30,000 foot level. And the idea is to come up with these concepts and then further develop them, which we, by the way, have brought these concepts to our board of directors 2 Mondays ago. And the direction was to further develop these so we can try to get ahead of the next storm season to address these immediate needs. So in terms of these 2 areas that are to the north, you can see on that photo on the left-hand side, there's really a lack of beach, and the idea was to provide some additional rock reinforcement. But the added feature is now going to include sand replenishment or nourishment as part of the sort of the comprehensive solution. And the concept is to basically place the additional rock to anchor the railroad and then also cover that with the sand that we would be providing as part of this project. Next slide. So here's an aerial view of the same areas 1 and 2. It's roughly a 2/3 mile stretch. On the left side, you can see the approximate quantity of rocks that's being proposed. I want to emphasize again, this is very much at a planning level. That doesn't mean what we'll ultimately end up with is going to be the same as what you're seeing today, primarily because once we get into further engineering, planning, design, and so forth, the dimension of the project is very much going to morph. And the idea is also to always, you start out with a bigger footprint with project development, and as you get deeper into the project development process, the idea is to basically shrink the footprint to what is really necessary to address the issue at hand. So in looking at the sand nourishment, as I mentioned, it would provide a 50-foot wide dry beach between that 2/3 mile stretch along 203.8 to 204.4 mile post. And the amount of sand that we're looking, an approximate amount is around 240,000 cubic yards of sand. Just to put in perspective, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is currently working on, and I believe concluding their sand nourishment project that they're partnering with the city of San Clemente, and it's roughly about 251,000 cubic yard. Although from my understanding, they're still working on completing the rest of the placement of the sand perhaps later this year. So next slide, please. So for area number 3, this is the one of the 4 areas that's identified inland. It's roughly a half-mile stretch of the inland part of the rail that we have assessed and determined would be vulnerable to multiple landslides and hence potential for additional rail closures. In fact, one segment of this, namely the Mariposa pedestrian bridge that you see in the left picture there, roughly a 200-foot wide swath of that bridge, 2 spans were taken out by a landslide back in January of this year. And we had to undertake an emergency project. That particular situation led to a 2-month closure between January to roughly mid-March. And there was an emergency project undertaken by OCTA as well as Metrolink to put a temporary catchment wall while the city and OCTA and the private property owner on top of the bluff works on a longer term solution. The other part of this is that pedestrian trail and the bridge is actually operated and owned by the city of San Clemente, but it's on OCTA right away through a lease agreement. So we'll need to work with the city on to maintain and restore the trail access. Next slide, please. And last but not least is area number 4. That's to the south near the San Clemente State Beach area. This particular area is a little different than areas 1 and 2, where in those particular areas there isn't a beach. Here is really more of a beach loss in terms of the depth. And so it's exposing the rail, which is above the person standing there, roughly 11 or 12 feet, to basically further erosion should there when there are high tides and so forth. So the concept here is to provide an engineering revetment, and with this updated concept, it would include sand nourishment as part of this concept. So the engineering revetment would include a filter fabric, and then the sand would come in afterward to cover up the engineering revetment, and they would provide roughly an 80 to 100-foot wide dry beach, which would effectively be more of a beach restoration. Next slide. Here's an aerial view of the 2/3 mile stretch of this particular area. So in looking at the rock reinforcement, it's a big range. And as I emphasized and touched on earlier, this is very much at a 30,000 foot level. The idea is to basically shrink the footprint as we get further and further into design, and obviously minimize any environmental impacts there would be with respect to the proposed solution. And then on the right side, you can see with respect to the sand nourishment in terms of the quantities, it's looking at 240 to about 300,000 cubic yard of sand. So in total, for these two areas, meaning 1 and 2, as well as area 4, you're looking at over 500,000 cubic yard of sand, which is quite an undertaking. And OCTA and the team has been talking to the Army Corps of Engineers, the Coastal Commission, and others to make sure that this is something that they can help us with in terms of the regulatory permitting process. So next slide. So with that, I'll hand it off to Christina, who's going to talk about the listening sessions.
Thank you, Dan. The goal of the listening sessions is to have a collaborative effort for us to get input from key stakeholders and various organizations. Our listening sessions seek to identify the key stakeholders in this corridor and share the expectation of maintaining in place the existing coastal rail line and minimizing passenger and freight service disruptions for up to 30 years. And of course, we're always looking to identify potential opportunities to further enhance our efforts. Next slide, please. I wanted to summarize the feedback that we've received to date during the listening sessions. We've had quite a few thus far, listening sessions with federal, state, and regional partner agencies, corridor cities, major employers, residential communities, and the general public. Some reoccurring themes include consideration of natural resources, natural solutions such as sand and a living shoreline, as well as integration of previous studies, consideration of armoring impacts to major employers and regional tourism, and of course, the obligation for OCTA to keep the railroad operational. Next slide, please. Now we will be proceeding into the formal listening session portion of the evening. This is a summary of, again, how you can participate. Verbal comments and questions are encouraged, and you can click on participants to raise your hand, as well as typing in any comments and questions in the Q&A function. I will be toggling back and forth between comments, written comments, as well as those that have raised their hand and wish to speak. And then, of course, you can also participate via phone. There's a few instructions here with *9 on your keypad to raise your hand, and I will be announcing you with the last 4 digits of your phone number in order for you to unmute and then speak accordingly. So with that, I'm going ahead and start listing off some of the questions. Tony Nelson has a series of questions she's put in the chat, and I'm going to go ahead and read them now. So she can go ahead and we can go ahead and address those. The first being, many, if not most, geological studies cite moisture and water-clogged bluffs as a major factor in slides. Can you explain why you have not tried to get ahead of potential slides and perhaps even prevent them by monitoring moisture and curtailing train vibrations when bluffs are soaked? Dan, do you want to respond to that?
So thank you for that question. Thank you, Christine. I just want to kind of address a couple of items, and then I'll pass it off to our team to kind of elaborate more on it. I think one way to look at in terms of the causality, if you will, that's been brought up on multiple occasions as to perhaps the trains are the culprit in terms of causing the bluff failures. I think that's maybe one way to look at it. I think when you look at the history of the railroad operations, 1888, that's the graphic that I put up earlier, through 2021, there hadn't been a lot of major closures as a result of, for instance, bluff failures that's affecting the railroad. And mind you, the operation of the railroad, whether it's freight line or passenger rail service, have been in service for over 100 years. It's not really until fall of 2021 where we have had a number of these issues, namely the bluff failures and the erosions that have led to closures and so forth. So we have not seen, as the railroad owner over the last 30 plus years, and in looking at the evidence, to suggest that the railroad really has any, I would say, association in terms of the causality with the bluff failures. So I think that's first and foremost what from our vantage point, how we're looking at this. And perhaps I'll pass this off to our consultant team to talk about some of the more technical issues in terms of the monitoring and also the vibration, monitoring of the vibration and the moisture. But I think one thing that we also need to recognize is property ownership. OCTA is the owner of the railroad right-of-way. That's give or take. It's not an exact measurement as you go from one segment to another, but generally, I believe between 75 to about 100-foot swath of the right-of-ways within OCTA's ownership. Outside of that is actually in private ownership. And so there's always a challenge of having to work outside of the right-of-way. So with that, perhaps I'll ask either Rob or George to chime in.
Yeah, I'll step in. Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? Is
Yes.
everything good? All right. So just to add I'll start with kind of maybe expanding a little bit on the causality of what's driving these landslides. And so Dan's correct. The railroad hasn't really seen a lot of this type of activity from the bluffs that are adjacent to us failing on top of the railroad. And so for the last for a long time, there have been bluff failures for many years. Everybody's seen that well before this, but they haven't really impacted the railroad to a point where we've had to take the tracks out of service and do these extensive repairs to protect ourselves from these landslides. Now, so really what we see is the cause of these bluff failures are stemming from activity, let's see, they're associated with the steepness of the slopes, unfavorable geologic conditions. They're really, very sandy conditions, surface runoff, extensive surface runoff, and the groundwater saturation. Now, the extensive surface runoff, it extends from even the other side of the 5 that's saturating these bluffs. All of the water is essentially directed at this location, and we're the buffer between these property owners, the bluffs, and the ocean. And so the railroad, in some senses, is protecting these bluffs, because if the railroad wasn't there, the ocean would be eating away at these bluffs much faster and destabilizing the bluffs and everything that they're supporting. So the reality is, what we see is that's the causality. Fortunately, we've for the last 5 years, we've experienced these failures, so we've been able to actually place motion monitors on these slopes, and because we've had to take the train out of service, we've been able to actually monitor slope movements and failures during these events, and also with rail traffic and without rail traffic. And so all of the motion that we've seen has occurred was dictated by tidal influence, by rainfall, by those are the core elements that impacted movements when we utilized subsurface and surface monitors. And so there's really no connection between the vibration that is induced by freight or passenger rail and the causality to trigger or induce any motion on these bluffs. This has been evaluated by many different geotechnical engineers and geologists, and so these are incredibly reputable experts that have evaluated that. When we talk about, I know Ms. Nelson keeps mentioning monitoring groundwater. For us, really, the monitors are, it's important for us to monitor motion. And so we've installed monitors in different locations to monitor that motion. And we continue to do so. And so as we want to make sure that whatever's happening is predictive, so we can actually protect the railroad, our passenger service. As far as monitoring groundwater, for us, it really would not provide any actionable data to predict landslide locations that would potentially impact rail service. Monitoring or measuring train vibrations would not provide any valid data to predict landslides, because there's no evidence that train vibrations cause landslides. And so that's we're gonna we put together a Q&A for both of these questions. So we're gonna post those in the coming weeks. Hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you, Rob. I'm now going to call, or not necessarily call, he didn't raise his hand. I'm going to read Michael Laubach's comments. He's asking, has there been any sand placed at the 240-mile marker?
So I'm not really sure if this is specific to previously. I'm assuming, yeah, it's referring to previously. I'm not aware that there's been, well, first off, OCTA had not placed sand at milepost 204 previously. We are looking at placement of sand as part of the improvements that we're talking about. I know in talking to the city, there have been various sand nourishment. There in fact was an opportunistic sand nourishment permit that the city had years ago, and they're looking to revive that. So it's very possible the city of San Clemente had sand nourishment projects in that vicinity over the years. But as to OCTA, haven't done that. We have not actually placed sand in that particular area.
And Michael's other quick question is, when will the homeowners at the slide areas expect to hear from the city and OCTA? Homeowners at the slide areas expect to hear from OCTA in the city.
So as we're looking, if we're talking mainly about the milepost 204 to about 204.5, as we're working on the solution, which is potentially an inland, some sort of a catchment wall, we're working closely with the city to talk about, as I alluded to earlier, the restoration of the two spans of the Mariposa Point Bridge that's been taken out by this most recent landslide. So in terms of timing, we're hoping to basically have more refined engineering details in the upcoming months. But in terms of a definitive timeline, I can't really provide that, primarily because we're still sifting through all of that information in terms of trying to refine the 30,000-foot level information that I have provided. But obviously, as we have information that's significant and substantive enough, we will be sure to roll it out, in working with the city and the affected residents.
Thank you, Dan. Tom Eads has a question. What is OCTA's plan to mitigate the loss of beach in front of Cypress Shores, where the massive amounts of riprap has already been placed?
So thank you for that question. So the Cypress Shore area was, if I recall correctly, the first emergency we had in most recent memory. In fall of 2021, there was riprap that was put there because we were actually experiencing two different issues. There was a lack of beach, and then there was also a massive landslide that was moving the railroad to the tune of 28 inches to the west. So the massive ancient landslide that's located in the Cypress Shore community above the railroad was actually pushing the railroad that's to the bottom of it over 2 feet in a westerly direction. So to try to anchor the toe of the slope, we have put in additional riprap to try to protect it. We were finding that there were still some additional movements, even irrespective of the riprap that were placed there. So what we ended up having to do as a second phase of that remediation project was to actually provide tieback that would effectively contain the earth from continuing to move into in a westerly direction. So as to the question about the sand, we are working with the Coastal Commission to discuss what should be done in terms of the mitigation by way of whether it's, and I think some of you on the online are familiar with the Coastal Commission and their mitigation process, where there is a mitigation fund that we would be paying into, or would it actually be some sort of a project in that particular area by way of sand replenishment? That hasn't been decided in terms of which avenue, but that's been in discussion with the Coastal Commission as it relates to the Cypress Shore area.
Thank you, Dan. Nick Tarantino has the following question. Unfortunately, I had to join the call late. Forgive me if this question's been answered. Where are the funds required for all the armoring and sand replacement coming from?
So thank you, Nick, for that question. And I apologize. I actually should have touched on that. Currently, with the estimated 200, this is very much ballpark, I'll underscore, 250 to about $340 million for all of the solutions. That's inclusive of, I'll call them engineering plus the sand nourishment. There is no funding for that. There is really only funding sufficient enough for just the preliminary planning and engineering phase. So OCTA and our partner agency, Metrolink, are actively seeking state and federal funding for the comprehensive solutions. So in short, there is no funding for any of these solutions that we're looking at this junction in time.
Thank you, Dan. Would anyone like to raise their hand and ask a verbal question? I haven't seen any hands raised, and there's not any hands raised at this time. Michael, why don't you, Michael, you had your hand up, Laubach. Could you please, can we unmute Michael and allow him to speak?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we're set. Go ahead, Michael.
I hear, I've been at a couple of the previous meetings and I keep hearing about, I'm learning more than I really wanted to about riprap and the effects that it has. And it sounded to me like a lot of the riprap that they're throwing down at least the high tide area where the water's actually coming up to the rocks is causing a lot of the sand to backwash out. I mean, I've surfed that area at 204s, and those waves, the backwash is actually big enough you can ride a wave out. And they were telling me that some of the sand is actually washing from beneath the rocks because of this backwash back and forth. And the more riprap we throw out there seems to only make it worse. And I was wondering, like with the shores area further south, that all the riprap they throw down there, there's talk now there's no beach, and I'm wondering if that's why there's no beach, that they keep putting more and more of the riprap out there, and seems to be a circling event. And I don't know if I don't know if anyone, on the OCTA or the engineers have confirmed that the riprap does cause the sand to wash out. Does anybody know?
So thank you, Michael, for that comment and question. I'll attempt to respond to it. It's been talked about on a number of occasions as to the causality. I think what I want to establish very clearly is OCTA, or let's just not take a step back and not talk about OCTA. The railroad is not the causality of the beach loss. The beach loss is a natural phenomenon that we have seen started happening in 2017. Otherwise, the railroad had been there for over 130 years. If you were to say that there's a direct linkage between the railroad and the beach loss, that should have happened, pick a number, first 50 years, 75 years, and so forth. So that's really what I want to make sure that's clear. And then secondly, as to whether or not the riprap that have been placed there to protect the railroad is leading to additional sand loss. We have had discussions with academia and the scientists out there. There's been discussions about anytime you put in some sort of non-natural barrier, it just makes it more difficult for the sand to naturally replenish. And that's otherwise known as more of a passive erosion. So we are cognizant of that. But what is unfortunate is there is no beach that's come back to buffer us like it had over, let's say the first 130 years of the railroad in its existence. So we are mindful of that, which is the reason why in this updated initial assessment, in terms of looking at the immediate needs, we included sand that would be sufficient to, if you will, cover the engineer solutions, whether it's the riprap or the engineer revetment that is on the seaward side, in the hope that it's going to help the natural replenishment or facilitate that natural replenishment process. So I would say the science is quite not there yet in terms of the direct causality, because there are basically differences in opinions out there, but we do recognize that there is a school of thought that it does lead to some sort of passive erosion.
Dan, there's another question here. Is OCTA prepared to keep replenishing the sand buffer you create? This will necessitate frequent replenishment and/or sand retention strategies along the entire 7 miles of endangered coast. That question is from Tony Nelson.
So this was talked about at our board meeting on the 13th of this month. The amount of sand that OCTA is proposing, granted it is very much at a planning level, is a tremendous amount of sand to the tune of over 500,000 cubic yards. The idea is to basically mitigate for the engineering solutions that we're proposing. And I think what we're wanting to do is to jumpstart the program, but I think to really tackle the question head first, we're not planning to be doing this on a regular basis. We've made this very clear. The board has made it very clear that this is something that we want to be a partner in, a good neighbor in terms of being part of the solution, but others within the area do need to come along and help us with the ultimate solution that we all collectively need to look at in terms of protecting that coastline. This is something that we have talked to the Coastal Commission about, we've talked to the U.S. Army Corps about as well. So again, the amount of sand that we're proposing is not a small quantity, as you can see. And I think for those of you who are paying attention to what the Army Corps of Engineers is doing out there with respect to the city, they're facing a lot of challenges, even with half the amount of sand that we're proposing, in fact, having to come back on numerous occasions just to place a sufficient amount of sand due to a variety of challenges and issues. And we're very much cognizant of those challenges. So it is, in our minds, a very robust amount of sand that we're looking to place there that will really help jumpstart the whole kind of process, if you will.
Now I'd like to call on Wendy Morris. Wendy has her hand raised. Could we please unmute Wendy? Wendy, are you able to speak? Are we able to help Wendy unmute?
You should have access.
There we go, Wendy. I think you're
okay. Great. I have a few comments I'd like to make about several of the discussions going on. I've lived in my home for about 26, 27 years now, and I have seen a dramatic increase in the number of trains that go by since the time I moved in. And before that, I used to frequent San Clemente a lot. And I remember when my kids were little, there'd hardly be any trains. You may get 1 or 2 trains practically all day long going to Ice Beach. So I think, to say that all these years there's been no problems caused by trains. Well, we didn't have very many trains back then. And the trains, I think, go pretty darn fast, especially the freights. When they go by my house shakes. And maybe it's not one shake that's going to do it, but over years and years times of shaking, I think it does have an effect. Trains could go down a little slower, the freight trains in particular, but I think, you can't say that the trains don't affect it at all. I totally disagree with that. Another thing is, I was very active in Surf Rider a few years back, and I did take videos of the beach, probably 2010, and there was plenty of sand down at Cypress Shore. Then it seems like the railroad started adding more riprap, and you could tell that the more riprap that was added, the more sand loss occurred. It just went hand in hand. As the ocean waves got closer to the riprap, especially at particularly high tides and during storm events, the sand got washed out a lot faster where it interacted with the riprap than at places that was just sand. So I don't agree with your statement saying that the riprap doesn't increase the erosion of the sand. It definitely does, and I think there have been studies that prove that. And this beach is a natural resource. It's a very valuable recreational resource. I realize that we need it for transportation and national defense with Camp Pendleton, but I do not believe that the beach is worth sacrificing for the train. And I believe if you continue to just put down riprap and not replenish the sand, not just one time, but keep replenishing the sand, that we will eventually lose our beach at the cost of having the train tracks there. Or eventually, maybe they won't even be able to have train tracks there because of the loss of the beach. It's it's a public access. It's owned by all of us, and everyone loves the beach. It drives our economy in San Clemente, but still, it's something that is irreplaceable. So,
Thank you.
in my mind, the beach is much more important than the railroad tracks. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm done.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Morris. Tony Nelson, why don't you go ahead and unmute yourself so then we can hear your question. Just take a second. There you go. You should be able to speak now.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you for holding this session. It was very important that Bluff owners have a chance to weigh in on this stuff, and I do appreciate it. I just wanted to clarify a couple of things. First of all, I think you have all at OCTA heard testimony by Dr. Brett Sanders of UCI, and he stated pretty unequivocally that riprap kills beaches. He said there is absolutely no question that putting up riprap walls or any kind of other walls absolutely creates conditions where the waves slam against the walls, drop to the bottom, gouge away what little sand we have left, and actually exacerbate the condition. And we know that at Cypress Shore. It's very clear to anyone with eyes that when the riprap was added, the beach was lost. The other point I wanted to make to the people listening is that while you're going to be adding sand potentially in these 4 spots and only 500,000 cubic yards, I say only because Dr. Susie Whitelaw, who is a sedimentologist PhD, says that we need more like 2 million cubic yards. So 500,000 isn't all that much. But you're adding it in front of all this riprap. And there are areas where you're intending to go in up to 50 feet from the existing rail line. And that basically takes away all the dry sand we have. So I don't get how the sand buffer helps us if you're pouring sand into the ocean. The other point I wanted to make is that I don't think anyone is saying that trains are the only cause of Bluff failure, but I have no doubt that they are a contributing factor. I have read many geological studies that talk about the impact of moisture and the impact of vibration of all kinds. They specifically mentioned trains. There was one study that even looked at highway vibration from significant highways near wet conditions. That, you know, we're not blaming the trains for the slides. They're happening because we have the Capistrano Formation. We know that we have soft soils. We know we have ancient landslides. But there is no question that vibration and moisture are not a good mixture, and that the vibration can very much exacerbate the condition. The studies talk about earthquakes doing this, blasting or construction activity close by wet conditions can trigger slides. I don't think there's any doubt that the vibration that we feel in our beds 100 feet up is not also being felt in the soils. And I have asked repeatedly for any evidence in Public Records Act's requests for any evidence that OCTA has studied the phenomenon of the train vibration and whether this has an impact. And those requests come up with nothing. So I know you haven't studied it. So my request is that you do study it and at least rule it out. Because I know if my bed can feel it across PCH and up 100 feet, and I can feel my bed moving at night when those freight trains go by, I know that the soil underneath my home, underneath PCH and along the beach is feeling it too. I just can't understand why you can't seem to understand that having a bowl of basically wet jelly sitting on our bluffs with, 2 years of heavy rainfall, I don't understand why you can't see that the impact of vibration might have some exacerbating effect on the slides. I'd just like you to study it and monitor it. If you monitor just for motion, all you're saying is, oh, it's starting to move, let's get out of the way. That doesn't help us, and that doesn't prevent slides. I'd like to see you doing something proactive to work with us, maybe to encourage planting of denuded areas, maybe to monitor moisture and find out why so many of our bluffs are soaking wet all the time, even in the summer. Let's solve the problem and maybe prevent some of these millions and millions of dollars that you've had to invest. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Susie, I see that you would like to speak. I'm going to read your comment quickly, and then if you'd like to unmute yourself, we can do that. Susie has stated that Tony is correct. OCTA's consultant has stated that liquefaction caused by vibration of saturated sand is a potential problem. Their consultant is supposed to study this issue, but they haven't. I'm not sure if Susie, if you're able to use the raise your hand function. I don't know if you had another comment you'd like to share or if that is sufficient. I don't see your hand raised. Oh, there you are. Okay. So you should be able to unmute yourself, Susie. Go ahead.
Okay, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Well, Tony and I have talked a lot about this. This is Susie Whitelaw, and the person she was describing who has the PhD in geology, and I specialize in coastal and sand, coastal and sediment dynamics. Those of you who are living on the bluff, yes, indeed, there's a process called liquefaction, and it happens specifically in sand. And when the sand is saturated and then it's induced to vibration, it becomes basically like a liquid. And we all know that we can't stand on liquid. And so that is the process called liquefaction. And it's probably part of all of the landslides that have been happening around the coast. The consultant has indicated that they think there's an issue with the water coming in from the east side of the tracks, and that is in their initial assessment. What they have not even begun to acknowledge is that the water coming in from the west side of the tracks also could cause liquefaction. And the only way to get the water away is from the tracks, from the west side of the tracks, is a wide sandy beach. I also understand that Mr. Fu has said today that riprap does not cause or accelerate the erosion of the beach. And that's absolutely true. You put riprap over in Utah, it is not going to affect erosion of the beach. You put riprap on a beach that's 200 feet wide, it's really not going to affect the erosion of the beach. You put riprap on a beach and the beach suddenly is 100 or 50 feet wide, then almost every storm, every high tide, that water is going to be rising up against the rocks. You do not need to have a PhD in sediment dynamics to understand that that is causing increased turbulence, and that increased turbulence will cause the sediments to become suspended up in the water. It also does cause something called a reflected wave, which tends to transport all that sediment that's been suspended now offshore. So you can have a seawall. However, if you have that seawall, you need to maintain a wide enough sandy beach in front of that so that your regular storm waves and your daily high tides are not rushing up against those rocks. And that's the reason why taking putting in more rocks, covering up the entire dry sandy beach on our entire of San Clemente State Beach, and then trying to put the slurry of sediment in front of that and creating maybe a 50-foot beach in front of that for a couple of months during the wintertime isn't going to last. And that's not a well thought out sand replenishment program. You need to put out at least 100 feet, maybe 200 feet to create that. And there's another issue with the sand replenishment program that's being proposed. For example, on the north ones, the reinforcement areas 1 and 2 or 1 and 3, I forget which ones they are. You're proposing to put 250,000 yards of sand over about 3,200 feet. And you say that's going to achieve a 50-foot increase in beach width. And then you're going to take the same amount of sand on the south end over a slightly larger length of shoreline. And now all of a sudden you're saying that that's going to create 80 to 100 feet of beach. And that's just not possible. That's not going to happen. It's still going to be about 50 feet of beach where once you put the rocks there is going to be 0 feet of beach. And so you're basically going to put a highly turbulent environment, and you're going to put we've all seen what's coming out of that pipe. It's a slurry of sediment, slurry of sand. It's not going to last there. And I guess those are my main issues I'd like to talk about. Thank you.
Thank you, Susie. Is there anyone else that wishes to speak? I don't see any other hands raised. Well, actually, Rich Hine. Can we unmute Rich so he may speak?
There you go. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, my name is Rich Heine. I live in Capistrano Beach, and I indeed feel the vibration of the trains at night as well, especially around 12:30 when a big freight rolls through here. But the other thing I wanted to comment on was Mr. Liu's one slide, which indicated that there had not been much beach problems for the first 130 years of the railroad being along the beach. And it showed most of the bluff failures occurring, I believe, after 2000. I don't have the slide in front of me. Correct me if I'm wrong, but back in 1993, wasn't there a significant bluff failure where Camino Capistrano comes down to PCH in San Clemente? And I believe I heard that it closed both the railroad and the PCH immediately. I think they got the railroad cleared fairly quickly, but PCH was up at about 6 months, and they've completely armored that entire bluff along there at this point. So these bluff failures have been going on for longer than I think Mr. Liu indicated. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rich. Is there anyone else that wishes to ask a question by raising their hands? I saw someone else briefly, but they've just, Barbara Grattan. Are you still with us, Barbara? I saw you raise your hand briefly. You may also put your questions in the Q&A if you wish to. We can read those aloud as well. And again, feel free to use the raise your hand function, and I will call on you accordingly. We have a few more minutes in our session. So last call before we go ahead and proceed with the presentation. All right, I don't see any hands raised or any new questions in the chat. So if you could go to the next slide, please.
Christina,
Oh, I'm
Barbara
sorry.
did add a question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I can read it. What
Oh.
was the weight of the freight goods transported pre-2017 versus today? What was the amount of goods transported in 2017?
So this is Dan. Thank you for that question. I don't have the answer in my fingertips, but we can certainly look into that. And what we could do is post that in a future frequently asked questions. And something I didn't mention earlier, in terms of the relationship of OCTA and the railroad operators, it's rather complex in the sense that while OCTA owns the railroad right away, we're not the operator of record. So with respect to the way it works with the Federal Railroad Administration, there are specific operator or operators of record. And in the case of the rail line that we're talking about in South Orange County, the operators of record is actually Metrolink on the passenger front, with Amtrak, which is a state service, being what they call a tenant within that railroad operating right away. And then on the freight side, it's actually BNSF Railway. So it's a little bit complex in terms of typically when you have a public agency that's an owner, it typically is the operator, if you will. But in the case of the railroad, it's not the case where OCTA owns the railroad right away, but it is not the operator of record. And I think where that's kind of important from a public facing standpoint is a lot of the decisions in terms of the operational decisions are actually made by the operator of record. So for instance, the decision to either cease service or to continue service as a result of the landslide is really a decision that's made by by Metrolink, although in consultation with OCTA, but really the buck stops with them in terms of that particular decision-making process. So I just wanted to kind of point that out since I didn't talk about that earlier.
Thank you, Dan. Barbara wanted to add that my question is based on the Wall Street Journal podcast last week, saying there is 1 billion of goods transported last year, and Surfliner is the busiest Amtrak in the country. So just wanted to add that.
Yeah, thank you for that information.
Sure. And then Deborah Winston-Levin has another question. How many trains go by now as opposed to 2017? I'm not sure if that's a question that you can answer right now, Dan.
Yeah, again, I don't want to speculate and just arbitrarily come up with a number. It is something that we can try to get from, if you're talking about Metrolink, there's a schedule, and then the Surfliner, there's a schedule, so that's pretty easy. But if you're talking about the Freightliner, we'll definitely need to ask of that information for BNSF Railway.
All right, and Michael has another question. Is there going to be any discussion regarding what, if anything, is expected of homeowners on the bluffs? Our property is where the landslide occurred and closed the bridge. We have redirected all the water off the bluff and directed to an abandoned city storm drain. What else can homeowners on the bluffs do?
I think not knowing the specifics, when we had that particular landslide, meaning the Mariposa Bridge, we worked closely with the city, and I believe and also the adjacent property owner, as far as I do recall back in February, where we were able to actually put plastic tarp on the bottom portion where OCTA has control, if you will, but we work with the property owner above on the very top to actually cover up that particular area to try to minimize any further erosion. So in terms of, you know, what else the property owners can do, I think what would be important is just trying to really assess knowing that water is the culprit in many instances, what are things that can be done to minimize any further runoff, whether it's looking at, and I'm just giving sort of generic examples of, in terms of looking at perhaps drought tolerant plant instead of plants that require a lot of watering and so on and so forth. Those would be some of the things that perhaps the property owners can look at. That is something that in Southern California over the last, not so much the most recent memory, but over the last decade and a half, we've had many, many years of drought. So that is very much kind of close in our minds as far as looking at natural or native drought tolerant type of plants. So anything to do to minimize sort of the amount of water would definitely be a contributing factor in terms of improving the overall conditions.
Thank you, Dan. I see that Wendy Morris has another question. She has her hand raised. Would you please unmute Wendy so she may ask her question?
Hello, are you there?
Yes, go ahead, Wendy.
I just want to make the comment that I know in the Portuguese Bend area of Los Angeles, they've been drilling wells to try and alleviate some of the landslides there. Has anybody thought of doing that in our area?
So my initial, yes, I'm aware of that up in that particular area. It would be outside of our right of way. At least that's my initial reaction. I'm not sure if our technical team have any thoughts about that, because when, you know, what they're basically up on top of the bluff, so they're looking at doing something you know, along those lines, but we're really on the bottom. So I don't know if the technical team have any thoughts about that.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? I didn't quite get the question. Can you state the example again, please?
Ms. Morris noted in the Portuguese Bend area up in LA, they had drill
They've had a
wells.
lot of landslides, and
Right.
one of the things that they're doing to try and prevent more landslides is they have wells, water wells that they drill and pump the water out. So I'm just wondering if, I know it's not in your area of property, but maybe there's some way you can get working with maybe Caltrans even onto their property where the freeway is, drilling wells there to get rid of the water that's going down into the bluffs. I mean, we know it's coming from all over the place, not just from the top of the bluff. It's coming, you know, from way inland. I know there's water coming into my home. And it's not coming from the top of the bluff. It's coming from groundwater that's, you know, been probably coming from the golf course beyond me. I mean, that's just another idea to think about as part of maybe, you know, helpful thing to do is maybe we could look into water wells. You might be able to use that water for irrigation of the golf course or, you know, other gray water areas that we need water at.
Thank
I
you.
think that's a good suggestion. Thank you. We'll
And
talk. We should definitely talk to the city about that, because I know the city was going to have a campaign to talk about how to deal with some of this water issues. So we'll engage with them.
Thank you, Rob. Chris Duncan, I see that you have your hand up. Would we be able to unmute Chris so he may ask his question? Go
Hi
ahead.
there, Chris Duncan here. Of course, I'm on city council in San Clemente, but I'm not calling as a city council member. I'm calling as a private resident. Thank you for holding this and bringing some attention to the Bluff failure. Question is narrowly, and I put it in the question Q&A too. You know, it stands to reason with all these trains moving all these years, the Bluff failures are always very close to the rail line. Is there any way to compel BNSF and the other operators to pitch in, help the city and OCTA pay for the erosion that is caused, got to be in part by some of the vibrations caused by rail trains going in great numbers very close to the bluffs? Is there any way to get some private investment from those entities to help us remediate the Bluff failures.
So thank you, Mr. Duncan, for your comment. I think we can certainly bring that, your question to, in this case, is really what I'm aware of is one freight operator in that particular neck of the woods, which is BNSF. So we can certainly bring that up with them. They were very much fully aware of what's going on there. Obviously, with the closures, that's affected their operation as well over the last handful of years. So, you know, they are very much aware of the closures that's been happening in that area.
Thank you, Dan. Tony had another question. Do you have any plans to do the cost benefit analysis that coastal advocates have been calling for? The dollar and environmental costs of keeping the trains going is huge and the benefits are very small. The ridership is down by 50% and the freight represents 0.04% of California's freight movement. You are spending millions and risking our beaches. Please do an independent study of costs and benefits. If it is really a necessary line, you should welcome this analysis. The Wall Street Journal quoted a myth about it being the busiest rail line in the nation. Please check the articles in the Voice of OC refuting this claim.
So this has been brought up in the past, and I think, you know, there's a disagreement in terms of how we view this and how Ms. Nelson views it. So I think it's just better for us to move on in terms of there's an importance from our standpoint. We've talked about it, so I don't want to kind of sort of belabor those points.
No problem. We have some other comments here. Ed Molidi, with all the money being spent on these projects, will there be a fund to help homeowners with the cost of redirecting the water going down the slope?
I think the short answer is we're not looking at that because it's not, well, OCTA's rail line is on the bottom of the slope, and I think just to kind of look at it from contextually, and I believe Ms. Morris is someone that brought it up earlier, that it's a whole different contributing factors, whether you could argue from roadways and the state highway facility, property owners, and so on and so forth. So that is not currently something that's being considered.
And then Nick Tarantino, as I understand the answer to my question above, there are no funds set aside to cover the cost of the armoring, sand replacement, etc. His second question is, much work has already been done. Where did those funds come from?
So I believe Mr. Tarantino is referring to the emergencies, I believe $37 million or thereabout that I had talked about earlier with the 4 projects and 5 closures over the last handful of years. That was funded through a portion of local funds, as well as I believe it was mainly state and some federal funding, but mostly state funding of the $37 million that's been spent so far in reaction to those previous emergency projects.
Thank you, Dan. Barbara Granton has a comment. I don't think it's logical to say the trains don't cause the bluff failures until we look at the amount of weight being transported below the bluffs prior to the bluff failures. Also, the amount of trains, weight of goods, and amount of goods needs to be evaluated. That's a comment from Barbara. All right, do we have any other folks that wish to raise their hand or put a question in the chat before we conclude our presentation today? I don't see any others. Team, did I miss anything?
Everything looks cleared.
All right. Next slide, please. I would just like to refresh your memory, if you may not have seen this in the past, as far as all the listening sessions we've had to date. I mentioned some of these categories previously. As Dan mentioned, we've been meeting with our project development team, but also individual stakeholder groups since February of this year. And we do have one more general public listening session coming up on May 30th. That will be conducted in person at 5 p.m. at San Clemente City Hall. And if you go to our Coastal Rail Resiliency Study website, next slide, please. We have information regarding that listening session there. And as I mentioned earlier, we also have our frequently asked questions, all the presentations for all the listening sessions to date, as well as the recordings, and any other materials associated with the project, with the study, especially the initial assessment that Dan Fu mentioned earlier. That's also available on the website for you to download. Because you participated in this listening session, you are now on our database. So any updates regarding the study will be sent to you accordingly. And I do encourage you to go to that website on a regular basis. We are uploading information pretty much on a weekly basis at this point. And if you have any additional comments or questions as time goes on, please don't hesitate to reach out to Dan or myself. Our email addresses are here on this slide, and our phone numbers are as well. That concludes our event this evening, and I thank you very much for your participation and have a good evening.